In the steaming jungles of the Pacific during World War II, the most feared enemy was often the one no one could see. Long before U.S. Marines spotted Japanese infantry on the ground, they were already being watched from above. Hidden high in palm trees and thick jungle canopy, Japanese snipers turned the vertical battlefield into a deadly advantage. What made them so terrifying was not just their accuracy, but their patience. Some tied themselves to treetops with rope or cloth harnesses, blending into the fronds, waiting motionless for hours or even days. Japanese sniper doctrine emphasized concealment, discipline, and psychological impact. Many were trained marksmen who understood that killing a single officer, radio man, or medic could disrupt an entire unit. Instead of firing repeatedly, they waited for the perfect shot. A Marine lieutenant lifting binoculars, a corpsman kneeling beside a wounded soldier, a radio operator extending an antenna. One crack of a rifle, and chaos followed. The jungle would fall silent, and every Marine would instinctively look downward, searching bushes and shadows, while the real threat remained directly overhead. The Pacific Islands provided the perfect environment for this kind of warfare. On islands like Guadalcanal, dense vegetation, towering coconut palms, and tangled undergrowth created a three-dimensional battlefield unlike anything most American troops had trained for. Traditional marksmanship training focused on horizontal engagements. Enemy soldiers were expected to appear across fields, ridgelines, or defensive positions. In the jungle, visibility was often less than 50 meters, and when shots came from above, the confusion multiplied. Marines quickly learned a chilling pattern. A unit would move cautiously through thick foliage. There would be no warning, just the sudden snap of a rifle shot, followed by a Marine collapsing. The direction of the sound was distorted by branches and echo. Some swore the bullet came from ground level. Others insisted it came from deep within the trees. By the time anyone pinpointed the likely direction, the sniper had already shifted position or gone silent. What made these tree snipers especially effective was their ability to exploit hesitation. Firing blindly into treetops wasted ammunition and revealed positions. Climbing after them was nearly suicidal. Some snipers carried extra ammunition and even food, prepared to stay elevated for extended periods. In certain documented cases, Japanese soldiers were found tied into trees after being killed, their ropes preventing them from falling even in death. The image left a lasting psychological scar on those who saw it. The psychological effect may have been even more powerful than the physical damage. Marines began scanning treetops constantly, their eyes drifting upward at every unusual movement. Sunlight filtering through palm leaves could resemble a rifle barrel. A shifting branch might trigger a volley of nervous return fire. Patrols slowed down, tension rose, sleep became difficult. Every rustle carried meaning, every shadow suggested a hidden marksman. Standard counter-sniper tactics struggled in this environment. Spotting scopes were difficult to use through dense foliage. Rifle fire aimed at suspected positions often passed harmlessly through leaves without hitting the concealed shooter. Even when Marines believed they had located a sniper, the elevation made accurate return shots extremely challenging. The sniper only needed a narrow firing slit through the vegetation. The Marines needed a clear visual confirmation, something the jungle rarely provided. Japanese forces understood the value of this fear. Their broader defensive strategy in the Pacific emphasized attrition and delay. Rather than meeting American forces in open battle, they sought to bleed them slowly, inflicting steady casualties that would sap morale and momentum. Snipers in trees became a force multiplier. A single hidden marksman could stall an entire platoon, pinning them down while other Japanese units maneuvered or fortified positions deeper inland. The effectiveness of elevated snipers also reflected a cultural emphasis on endurance and sacrifice. Many Japanese soldiers were prepared for missions that offered little chance of survival. Being alone in a treetop, exposed to heat, insects, and counterfire, required extraordinary discipline. They accepted isolation as part of their duty, and that willingness to endure extreme discomfort made them unpredictable opponents. For the Marines on the ground, the realization that death could come from directly overhead shattered conventional battlefield instincts. Training manuals had not prepared them for enemies who used the jungle canopy as a firing platform. Officers began ordering men to check treetops before moving into clearings. Some units designated specific Marines to watch only the upper foliage. Yet even with precautions, casualties continued. The jungle itself seemed to conspire with the snipers. Coconut palms were tall, sturdy, and abundant. Their trunks provided elevation, and their crowns offered natural camouflage. Vines and thick leaves masked subtle movements. From above, a sniper could observe troop movements, identify leadership figures, and select targets with patience. Below, Marines sweated under heavy packs, their vision obstructed, and their nerves stretched thin. By late stages of early campaigns, frustration was mounting. The sniper threat was not decisive in terms of total casualties, but its psychological weight far exceeded the numbers. It slowed advances, disrupted coordination, and forced Marines to adapt in ways they had never anticipated. The battlefield was no longer simply in front of them, it was above them, hidden in simple sight. This deadly contest between unseen hunters and exposed infantry marked the beginning of a tactical shift. The Marines would eventually respond in ways the snipers did not expect. But at this stage of the war, the advantage belonged to those who mastered concealment and elevation. In the suffocating heat of the Pacific jungle, the trees themselves had become weapons, and until a new solution emerged, every palm tree was a potential rifle barrel pointed downward, waiting for the next trigger pull. By the time American forces pushed deeper into the Pacific Islands, the fear of treetop snipers had evolved into something more dangerous than surprise. It had become routine. Patrols no longer reacted with shock when a single rifle shot cracked through the humid air. Instead, they froze automatically, dropping into defensive positions, scanning in every direction. The problem was not courage, it was uncertainty. Marines were trained to return fire quickly and aggressively, but in the jungle canopy, there was rarely a clear target to shoot at. On islands such as Peleliu, where brutal fighting unfolded in 1944, terrain amplified the sniper problem. Coral ridges, scrub jungle, and scattered palm trees created overlapping layers of concealment. When a sniper fired from elevation, sound ricocheted unpredictably. The shot seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Marines often fired volleys into likely treetops, but leaves and thin branches absorbed or deflected rounds. The sniper needed only a narrow opening to aim through. The Marines needed a fully exposed silhouette to guarantee a hit. Standard counter-sniper doctrine emphasized triangulation. If multiple Marines identified the direction of a shot, they could converge fire onto a suspected position. In open terrain, this method worked reasonably well. In jungle conditions, it broke down. Echo distorted angles, visibility was blocked, and even when a tree was correctly identified, spotting a camouflaged sniper wedged into the crown was nearly impossible without binoculars, and raising binoculars made an officer an immediate target. Some units attempted to counter elevation with elevation. Marines carrying Browning automatic rifles, known as bars, were ordered to saturate treetops with suppressive fire. The bar's higher rate of fire increased the chance of striking something beyond foliage, but ammunition was limited and sustained firing revealed positions. Moreover, Suppressive bursts often failed to produce visible results. No falling body, no dropped weapon, just shredded leaves drifting slowly to the ground. Mortars were another option. A well-placed mortar round could devastate a suspected sniper position. Yet mortars required time to set up and accurate coordinates to be effective. In a fluid jungle skirmish, pinpointing a single hidden marksman did not always justify expending valuable high-explosive rounds. Mortar blasts also risked injuring friendly troops advancing nearby. The jungle compressed distances so tightly that indirect fire carried serious risks. Flamethrowers were considered in certain engagements, particularly when snipers were believed to be operating from specific clusters of trees. While devastating at close range, flamethrowers required dangerously close proximity and were limited by fuel capacity. Approaching within range of a concealed sniper exposed the operator to almost certain retaliation. The weapon that terrorized bunkers was not always practical against a nearly invisible shooter 30 feet above the ground. Snipers on the Japanese side adapted as well. When they realized Marines were scanning treetops more aggressively, they reduced movement to almost nothing. Some reportedly wrapped parts of their rifles to minimize reflection. Others waited for moments of distraction, artillery impacts, aircraft flyovers, or heavy ground fighting to mask the sound of their shots. The discipline required was immense. They understood that survival depended on patience. The psychological burden intensified over time. Marines began firing at suspicious movement preemptively. A shifting branch could trigger a burst of automatic fire. Units sometimes spent precious minutes engaging empty foliage. Ammunition consumption increased. Fatigue deepened. Every patrol demanded heightened alertness, and in tropical heat, sustained hypervigilance drained energy quickly. Commanders faced a dilemma. Aggressive movement invited sniper fire. Slow, cautious advances surrendered momentum. Neither option was ideal. Officers adjusted formations, spreading men farther apart to reduce clustered casualties. Radio men were ordered to remain under extra cover. Corpsmen moved carefully between positions, but none of these measures removed the fundamental problem, the enemy's vertical advantage. Reports from the field increasingly described the same pattern. A single hidden shooter could delay an entire company's progress. In some cases, units halted for extended periods until they were confident the sniper had been neutralized or had withdrawn. The time lost might seem minor in isolation, but across weeks of campaigning, these delays accumulated. Jungle warfare was already slow and grueling. Snipers amplified that friction. Attempts were made to designate skilled marksmen within Marine units specifically for counter-sniper roles. Scoped rifles, though less common than later in the war, were used where available. These designated shooters focused solely on treetops. Occasionally, patience paid off. A slight movement, a glint of metal, or a subtle silhouette against the sky betrayed a position. When that happened, the return shot was swift and deliberate. Such successes were rare enough to feel like exceptions rather than solutions. The reality was stark. Traditional precision-based responses were not matching the sniper's concealment advantage. The jungle provided too many hiding places and too few clean lines of sight. Even when Marines believed they had eliminated a shooter, uncertainty lingered. Was he truly alone? Was there another watching silently from a neighboring tree? As casualties mounted and frustration grew, the search for a more decisive answer intensified. The problem was not just about marksmanship, it was about geometry. The battlefield extended upwards, and as long as the trees stood intact, they offered protection and dominance to anyone willing to climb them. The Marines were beginning to understand a harsh truth. Matching patience with patience was inefficient. Matching concealment with concealment was unreliable.
If the enemy's strength came from elevation and cover, perhaps the solution was not to outshoot the sniper, but to remove the cover entirely. That realization would soon transform the contest from a duel of hidden marksmen into something far louder, far more destructive, and impossible to ignore.
By late 1943 and into 1944, frustration with jungle snipers was reaching a breaking point. Patrol reports repeated the same pattern: a single shot from above, a Marine down, and no clear target in sight. Rifle fire into foliage wasted ammunition. Mortars were slow and imprecise for isolated shooters. The enemy's advantage came from elevation and concealment. As long as the trees stood, the sniper had protection. What changed the equation was not a new rifle, not a new scope, but a weapon never designed for this purpose at all. The 40mm anti-aircraft gun, specifically the Bofors 40mm L60 gun, had already earned a reputation as one of the most effective air defense weapons of the war. Originally developed in Sweden and adopted widely by Allied forces, it was built to destroy fast-moving aircraft with rapid, high-explosive shells. It fired a 40mm round at a high rate, sending explosive projectiles into the sky to intercept dive bombers and strafing planes. In naval battles across the Pacific, it proved devastating against Japanese aircraft. But in the dense jungles of Pacific Islands, Marines began to realize something critical. If a 40mm shell could rip apart an aircraft fuselage at hundreds of meters, what would it do to a palm tree? The answer was immediate and violent. When high-explosive 40mm rounds struck a tree trunk or detonated within its crown, the effect was overwhelming. Instead of a narrow bullet channel slicing through leaves, the shell exploded on impact, shredding wood fibers, splintering trunks, and blasting apart entire clusters of branches. In seconds, a tree that had provided perfect concealment became a shower of debris. Leaves, bark, and fragments rained down, and any sniper positioned there was either killed outright or violently thrown from his perch. The decision to employ anti-aircraft guns in a ground role was born out of battlefield improvisation. On several Pacific islands, including operations around Guadalcanal in earlier stages and later campaigns such as Okinawa, Marines and attached units had access to 40mm guns primarily for air defense. As Japanese air power diminished in certain areas, these guns were sometimes available for alternative tasks. Faced with persistent sniper threats in treetops, commanders authorized their use against ground-based elevated targets. The psychological shift was dramatic. Previously, counter-sniper engagements had been tense, quiet duels, rifle against rifle, patience against patience. The introduction of the 40mm shattered that dynamic. Instead of searching painstakingly for a concealed silhouette, Marines could identify a suspicious tree and simply eliminate the entire structure as a firing platform. It was no longer about pinpoint accuracy, it was about removing the environment that enabled the threat. Gun crews adapted quickly. Spotters would indicate suspected sniper locations. The Bofors crew adjusted elevation downward, aligning the barrel not toward the sky, but toward the canopy line. A short burst, sometimes just a few rounds, was enough. The rapid, thumping recoil of the gun echoed through the jungle, far louder than any rifle shot. Explosions tore into the treetops. Within moments, what had been a green, towering palm could become a shattered trunk stripped of foliage. For Marines pinned down by sniper fire, the sense was both tactical and emotional. The sense of helplessness that came from firing blindly upward was replaced with visible, destructive results. When the 40mm rounds hit, everyone could see the impact. There was no ambiguity about whether something significant had happened. Even if the sniper had already fled, the tree was no longer usable. Japanese forces were not prepared for this level of response. Their sniper tactics relied heavily on the assumption that concealment in the canopy provided relative safety from small arms fire. A rifle bullet might miss,
Even multiple bullets might fail to penetrate thick wood at the right angle, but a high explosive shell changed the physics entirely. Shock waves, fragmentation, and structural destruction made treetop positions extraordinarily dangerous once identified. The noise alone had a profound effect. The jungle, often filled with the isolated crack of rifles and the distant rumble of artillery, suddenly erupted with the concussive blasts of anti-aircraft fire used horizontally. The thunderous bursts sent a message. The Americans were willing to escalate dramatically to eliminate hidden threats. Snipers who once felt dominant in elevated positions now faced the possibility that a single shot could invite overwhelming retaliation. There were practical limitations, of course. The 40mm guns were heavy and required setup. They could not accompany every small patrol deep into dense jungle. Their use was more common near established positions, beachheads, or larger operations where anti-aircraft units were already deployed. But whenever they were available, they introduced a new calculation into the battlefield equation. The transformation was conceptual as much as tactical. Instead of treating each sniper as an individual marksman to outduel, Marines began thinking in terms of environmental denial. If trees offered protection, destroy the trees. If elevation provided advantage, remove the elevation. The jungle was no longer sacred terrain to maneuver through cautiously. In critical moments, it became something to tear apart. This shift marked a turning point. The contest between hidden shooter and exposed infantry was no longer balanced. Precision met its counter in explosive force. The vertical sanctuary that once empowered Japanese snipers was now vulnerable to rapid, devastating bursts of high explosive, and with each shattered trunk crashing to the ground, the message became clearer. In this phase of the war, survival would belong to the most patient marksman, but to the side willing to unleash the greater firepower.
Once the 40mm guns proved effective against treetop snipers, the change was not just tactical, it was philosophical. The battlefield mindset shifted from reaction to preemption. Instead of waiting for a sniper to fire and reveal his approximate location, Marines increasingly treated suspicious tree lines as threats in advance. The logic was simple and ruthless. If a tree could hide a rifleman, then the tree itself was a potential enemy position. During later Pacific campaigns such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, American forces were already applying overwhelming firepower to fortified caves, bunkers, and ridgelines. The use of artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support had become standard tools for reducing resistance before infantry advanced. The application of 40mm anti-aircraft guns against elevated sniper positions fit naturally into this broader doctrine. Jungle warfare was no longer a cautious game of hide and seek. It was increasingly an exercise in systematic destruction of anything that could conceal an enemy. When a Marine unit prepared to move through a contested area near established positions, suspected sniper zones were sometimes cleared deliberately. Spotters scanned for unusual shapes in palm crowns or unnatural stillness among branches. If suspicion lingered, the 40mm crews were called forward. A short, controlled burst would rip through the canopy. The visual effect was immediate: splintered trunks, falling fronds, shredded vegetation. Even if no sniper was confirmed, the area was neutralized as a future firing platform. This approach created what could be described as environmental denial. The Japanese sniper's greatest strength, vertical concealment, was systematically removed. A palm tree without its crown offered no hiding place. A shattered trunk could not support a tied marksman. By reducing the number of viable elevated positions, Marines forced Japanese defenders to reconsider their methods. Some shifted more heavily into caves and ground-level camouflage. Others accepted greater risk by firing fewer shots and relocating more frequently. Psychologically, the balance of fear began to tilt. Earlier in the war, Marines had entered jungle clearings with tension rising, eyes darting upward, anticipating that inevitable crack of a rifle. Now, in areas where 40-millimeter guns were available, there was a different expectation. If a sniper fired, retaliation would be immediate and overwhelming. The knowledge that concealment could be obliterated in seconds reduced hesitation. It restored momentum. For Japanese snipers, the shift was deeply unsettling. Their doctrine emphasized patience, precision, and calculated targeting. But the new American response did not require precise identification. A suspected tree was enough. Once the first explosive round detonated near a canopy, any sense of sanctuary vanished. Even if a sniper survived the initial blast, the shock wave and fragmentation made maintaining position nearly impossible. The advantage of height transformed into vulnerability. The thunder of 40-millimeter fire also carried a signaling effect beyond the immediate engagement. Other concealed defenders within earshot understood what it meant. The Americans were willing to use anti-aircraft weaponry against ground targets. That willingness suggested a broader truth about the evolving Pacific War. The United States possessed both the industrial capacity and the logistical strength to deploy heavy firepower wherever necessary. Jungle concealment alone would not guarantee safety. At the same time, the increased reliance on destructive force reshaped the landscape itself. Coconut groves that once stood dense and green became jagged fields of broken trunks. The visual character of certain battle zones changed dramatically after repeated engagements. Where snipers once climbed high above advancing troops, there were now open gaps in the canopy. Visibility improved. Movement became slightly less constrained. The environment that had favored ambush slowly became less forgiving for those who relied on elevation. However, the doctrine was not indiscriminate chaos. Ammunition for 40-millimeter guns remained valuable, and crews were trained to fire controlled bursts rather than continuous streams. Commanders balanced efficiency with necessity. The goal was not to level entire jungles, but to remove immediate threats and deny obvious sniper platforms. Even so, the contrast between the quiet crack of a rifle and the explosive roar of anti-aircraft fire underscored how dramatically the engagement had escalated. By this stage of the war, the sniper was no longer the invisible master of the canopy. The introduction of overwhelming firepower had forced a transformation in tactics on both sides. What began as a deadly vertical duel had evolved into a contest between concealment and industrial-scale firepower. The Americans chose not to match stealth with stealth, but to counter precision with force. In the end, the equation became brutally straightforward. A sniper could dominate as long as the tree remained intact. Remove the tree, and you remove the advantage. The jungle was still dangerous, still unpredictable, but it was no longer an uncontested sanctuary for hidden marksmen. The shift from cautious reaction to proactive destruction marked one more step in the relentless adaptation that defined the Pacific War. And in that adaptation, the message was unmistakable. No tree, no sniper. As the Pacific campaigns drew on, the lessons learned from combating elevated snipers left a lasting mark on military thinking. The use of 40-millimeter anti-aircraft guns against treetop positions was not merely a tactical innovation. It became a case study in how adaptation and overwhelming firepower could reshape a battlefield. The Marines had discovered that when traditional methods failed, sometimes the environment itself had to be neutralized. That lesson would echo far beyond the jungles of islands like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The broader implication was clear. Warfare is not static. The Japanese had perfected concealment, patience, and camouflage, turning the canopy into a lethal vantage point. Yet technological adaptation, combined with creative application, could reverse those advantages. By applying a weapon outside its original purpose, Marines forced a reevaluation of assumptions. The battlefield was not limited to horizontal lines of sight. Height and cover could no longer guarantee safety, and flexibility became essential for survival. This evolution in thinking also influenced future doctrines. After World War II, counter-sniper strategies began to consider more than individual skill. Planners integrated the idea of denying terrain advantages to adversaries. Modern militaries study similar concepts in urban combat, mountain warfare, and forested regions. If a high point or building provides a tactical edge, it can be neutralized before being used against friendly forces. In essence, the 40mm adaptation in the Pacific prefigured the integration of indirect fire, area denial, and environmental manipulation that would characterize later conflicts. The experience also raised ethical and tactical considerations. While neutralizing a sniper platform reduced casualties among American troops, it did so by indiscriminately destroying parts of the environment and potentially endangering any non-combatants nearby. Commanders had to weigh the immediate tactical benefits against the long-term consequences of altering the landscape. In isolated islands with limited civilian presence, the calculation favored aggressive action, but the principle highlighted the tension between necessity and proportionality, a dilemma that persists in modern conflict scenarios. From a psychological perspective, the impact on Japanese forces was profound. Their reliance on treetop snipers had been a source of confidence and strategic control. When entire trees were shattered with explosive force, the message was unmistakable. Concealment no longer ensured safety. Even well-trained marksmen had to rethink how, when, and where they would engage. The advantage of surprise had shifted decisively towards the side that could combine observation, coordination, and firepower. For the Marines, the solution represented more than just a method of killing snipers. It symbolized a philosophical shift from reacting to threats individually to thinking in terms of broader battlefield engineering. By denying enemy positions, controlling terrain, and using available resources creatively, small units could amplify their effectiveness dramatically. In the extreme environment of the Pacific Islands, ingenuity often mattered as much as courage. The legacy of these operations is visible in the doctrines of combined arms warfare. Modern militaries emphasize integration of infantry, artillery, engineers, and aerial support to dominate every dimension of the battlefield. The principle remains consistent. If a defensive advantage exists, find a way to neutralize it before it harms your forces. The Pacific campaigns demonstrated that such principles could be applied innovatively, even in the dense, unpredictable terrain of tropical islands. Finally, the story of elevated snipers and 40mm countermeasures is a reminder that combat is as much about adaptation as it is about firepower. The enemy may exploit a weakness, but a flexible, creative response can restore balance. Marines who had once felt trapped under invisible eyes learned that tools and tactics could redefine the contest. Height, concealment, and patience were powerful, but they were not invincible. By combining intelligence, observation, and extraordinary firepower, the U.S. forces turned the tables. In retrospect, the confrontation between treetop snipers and anti-aircraft guns illustrates a broader truth about warfare. Advantage is temporary, and survival depends on innovation. The jungle had once been a sanctuary for hidden shooters, but the introduction of overwhelming firepower transformed the landscape, physically, tactically, and psychologically. It was a lesson written in shattered palm trees, falling fronds, and the relentless logic of adaptation. And for the Marines who advanced across the Pacific, that lesson became one they would carry forward. To survive, you must be willing to see the battlefield differently and to act decisively when traditional methods fail.